There's news in the NFL today, and it's time to break it down in the only way we know how. Hot Route style, with our spin on football headlines with a mix of frozen tundras, neck rolls, and grass-stained jersey.
Hello and welcome back to Hot Routes. And boy, we do have some news to talk about, some hot news. Ryan Poles has been named the Chicago Bears general manager, which clears the way for the Vikings to hire Kwesi Adofo Mensah as their GM. That hasn't been finalized as of recording. It sounds like that's where it's going, though. So we're here to break that down and also do some other hot routes. We're not going to abandon the format completely, but we've got to get to that news first. Matt, I know earlier in the week you had been talking to people who had told you Poles is the Vikings number one. So what changed? Is that still the case from all the conversations you had? Was that the case leading up until he was in Chicago? And how did we get to this point right here?
Yeah, my understanding is that both these teams really wanted Ryan Poles to be their general manager. And after the Vikings had their first conversation with him, that he was in the driver's seat to be their GM, but he decided to still take the second interview from the Chicago Bears, and they didn't let him leave the building. I mean, this is like when you have a free agent trying to get offers the best that he can. And one team says, all right, we're going to put it all out on the table here. And he decided to go with the Chicago Bears. And, this isn't a situation where, Vikings fans should freak out or anything that Ryan Poles was the top candidate for them. And then they end up going with Kwesi Adofo Mensah because, these were their 1 and 2. These were their finalists for this job. Both of them have terrific backgrounds, and I think both have an opportunity to upgrade a lot of the processes that the Vikings were previously using. And now it also creates a little rivalry action here as well. It's not too often that a general manager decision ends up being looked back on as kind of a rivalry turning point. But the Bears and Vikings are in very similar positions. They have basically the same record over the last couple of years. They've been floating around in mediocrity and want to take that next step. Now Ryan Poles will try to do that in Chicago, and Kwesi Adofo Mensah will try to do that in Minnesota.
Yeah, and it's hard to know if it's a blunder or anything. If Poles was their number one choice, letting him go somewhere else to have any sort of conversation is a little bit of a blunder if that was the guy that you wanted. But this, again, is not to say Kwesi is a bad candidate or Poles one's better than the other. It's just interesting how it went down and how they, if it is the case that he was their top guy, they would even let him leave when they talk to him.
Right. It's rare that we have this happen where you kind of have two teams dueling for the same person for a general manager position or even a head coach. Usually each team kind of wants their guy and they know who they have in mind and they bring that person in. And we don't hear a whole lot of these two teams were fighting over this one person. It is interesting that Chicago was able to woo Ryan Poles away when it seemed like Minnesota was the front runner for him. But now he's in a position with Justin Fields to start their rebuild. He's got a little more cap space and a little better situation there in Chicago that might have played a role in it. It also might have been that they budgeted more money for their general manager than the Vikings did. That's hard to say. But, I think both general managers, they get kind of clean slate type of situations. Even though there is a quarterback in place in Chicago, there's a whole roster that's got open spots that Ryan Poles is going to have to fill there. And for the Vikings, there's a quarterback here, but how much longer Kirk Cousins is here will be the first decision on the docket for Kwesi Adofo Mensah. And then you're talking about a lot of other very interesting and some difficult decisions. Do you sign Danielle Hunter to a contract extension? Do you keep Dalvin Cook on his current contract? What do you do with Adam Thielen's huge cap hit for next year? There's a lot to be done in both of these positions. And also both general managers will be looking at this division finally as one that is much more wide open if either Aaron Rodgers leaves or retires, rather than taking a job knowing that you're going to be playing second fiddle to an elite quarterback. So both of these positions, I think, were very coveted. I think that they're both very attractive. Maybe you could say that the Vikings ownership is a little less vocal than Chicago's can be at times, and maybe a little more stable. But at the same time, both ownerships appear to be kind of hands off and are going to allow these GMs to build their teams and their vision. I think that's a major positive for both of them.
Yeah, and I know we'll have a whole nother video on head coaching candidates that may come with this hire. I know from some of the initial reporting, it doesn't sound like he comes with one or two guys specifically in mind, open to what the Vikings have casted a wide net. Is that something? I mean, it seems like the ball's starting to roll with other candidates, second interviews around the league. It seems like this thing's going to pick up relatively quickly here soon.
Right. And we always try to connect. This guy was in this place, so he's going to want to bring so-and-so with him, but that's not always the case. And I think that ownership for the Vikings did this the right way. I know that some people question, why are they interviewing head coaches before having a GM in place? And I think that they probably had their short list just along their first interviews with people like Ryan Poles and Kwesi Adofo Mensah of who they needed to talk to, of who that they would potentially be bringing in, and then they can get together and make a decision on a head coach. I do think it's interesting that there haven't been all that many offensive coordinator candidates. We all thought, well, they're immediately going to try and turn this thing that direction and go cutting edge offense and try to create stability, which they still could with some of the candidates that they requested, but they haven't announced any interviews with Brian Daboll from Buffalo or Byron Leftwich from Tampa Bay, which I think is a little surprising. And we'll see if that changes as they go forward after naming a general manager. They don't have to name a coach right away. If you're hiring a coach from one of the teams that is going to the Super Bowl, you have to wait to hire them anyway until they're done working. So there's still time to make that decision. But that is right off the bat. You got to make a new decision on a coach. You got to make a new decision on a quarterback, whether to keep Cousins, extend him, or to move on from him in a trade. And so we're going to get a very, very early idea of Adofo Mensah's vision. As like you said, as we record this, it's not official yet, but those were their two finalists and one guy took another job. So I think it's fair to say that he's going to be the guy making these decisions. And so he'll have major ones right off the bat. This isn't just, hey buddy, rebuild the defensive line. These are reshape this entire organization.
Yeah. I mean, compared to the Bears organization, it's not, okay, watch Justin Fields, see how it plays out, figure out how you're going to build around him. It's, oh no, you're going to have to figure out the quarterback. You're going to have to figure out how the defense is going to progress. You're going to have to figure out what you're going to do with some key veterans, guys that are kind of beloved by the fans. You have to make some tough decisions early. And the toughest one is that Kirk one. And what I think is so fascinating about this hire is the places he's been recently. He's been with the 49ers and the Browns, two teams that have quarterbacks pretty similar to the situation that you find yourself in with Kirk. Are you going to keep going? Are you going to extend him? Are you not going to extend him? Obviously, the Browns are dealing with that question right now with Baker Mayfield. He's probably been in countless situations and conversations with the Browns on what to do with Baker. So he's going to be very attuned to this type of conversation and what they could potentially be doing with Kirk. And maybe he was banging on the table for we can get the best out of Mayfield. Maybe he wasn't. We have no idea of where he could be standing there. But I think the Kirk one's going to be most interesting just based on where he's been and the quarterbacks that he's seen, because it's very, very similar to what he's going to see in Minnesota.
Right. And San Francisco has built a great roster around a quarterback that presently this year actually does have a high cap hit, and which is unusual for teams when it's not an elite quarterback. Of course, they're one punt block away from that being Aaron Rodgers in this game and not the San Francisco 49ers. That's where Adofo Mensah worked from 2013 to 2019. And they did build a winner that went to the Super Bowl with Jimmy Garoppolo, who lost to a team with a more physically gifted quarterback in that game in Patrick Mahomes. So you could try to tie these tangled webs together, but I think that the analytical background and the Wall Street style background of Adofo Mensah really makes you think about knowing the value of an NFL dollar. What is a dollar worth in cap space? The Vikings spent the most cap space in the NFL on linebackers this year. That's probably not the most efficient way to do business. And so when you're looking at positional value, how you want to manage the quarterback position is a thing to discuss too. I mean, if you end up with a huge cap hit with a middle of the road quarterback, I mean, how often does that get teams to the NFC Championship? Even if we kind of look at Jimmy Garoppolo and the 49ers that way, most of the time it's elite quarterbacks or it's young quarterbacks on rookie contracts. And I doubt that is lost on Adofo Mensah, but I mean, that would have had to have been a huge conversation in the interview process. What are you going to do at quarterback? Because as we see around the league, I mean, that's the thing. If you nail the quarterback position, you're in a spot to chase the Super Bowl every single year. If you miss on it, you're talking about how can we build the roster? What guards can we get or whatever else? to try and fill out a roster, but it usually doesn't work all that often. So that is the decision that we're going to find out right away. How does Kwesi Adofo Mensah just view a football dollar and view salary cap space and things like that? Because there's lots of decisions on the table for him in the first 2 months or 3 months of his tenure that will tell us a lot about that.
Yeah. And if you want a full breakdown of the news today, you just put up a podcast on Purple Insider. So if you haven't had a chance to go listen to that, that's Sam, that's Matt talking about it, an extensive look at it and kind of comparing the two jobs, the Bears and the Vikings, and both of their paths from here as we get this news today. But now we're going to move on to just some hot routes. They're going to be obviously tailored a little bit to this GM search or this GM and head coaching situation. And the first one revolves around Kirk and that big decision they're going to have to make. I think it's safe to say he's at least on the block as someone that if teams are interested in, they can go and ask. That's usually what happens when a new GM comes in anyways. It's not their guys. So even if this wasn't the Kirk situation with the contract, usually all the players are kind of on the table. So I want to know from you, if we're just ranking fun places, trade destinations that Kirk could go, what would be the most entertaining? Maybe we're combining this with feasible. He's not going to the Chiefs or anything like that, but fun, entertaining, feasible in this market. Where does your mind jump to in terms of top Kirk destinations?
Well, the most ironic would be Washington.
Yeah.
They don't have a quarterback presently. Taylor Heineke is more of a backup quarterback, and they would be a team that has a high draft pick that the Vikings could try to, pry away from Washington and send him back there. And also, if you're Washington, I don't think they would ever do it because of Daniel Snyder being their owner. I think he would give the thumbs down to that, considering how ugly the negotiations got there. But it would actually be a good fit. They have some good receivers. They have a lot of defensive pieces to work around. So I don't think that's likely at all, but it would kind of be the one that would make you chuckle and the one that fits a lot. I would have said that New Orleans would have been a great position for Cousins to go, but now without Sean Payton in New Orleans, that becomes quite a bit different. If they turn things over to Dennis Allen potentially there, or they decide to go out and hire a new coach, it is different from having Sean Payton, who's one of the great offensive minds really in NFL history when you look at the numbers that Drew Brees put up when paired with Sean Payton. Beyond that, Pittsburgh could be an interesting location. I think that that's a team that doesn't want to take a step back. And even the New York Giants have some players. They've just had very poor quarterback play and extremely poor coaching. And you think that you look at the NFC East and you don't believe that anybody is spectacular there. I think that would be another team that should be making the phone call too. If they stick with Daniel Jones for another year, I mean, you're probably talking about another year of just being mediocre or not that good. So a new GM there, a new coach there. It'll be very interesting to see what they want to do with the quarterback position, if they think Jones is a guy to build around or not. I don't think that he's shown much to say that he is, so that should be another target for the Vikings. Did you have one, Paul, that was different from those?
I think the Giants is an interesting one because I think in general people think of Kirk Cousins destinations and they think of teams that were in similar positions to the Vikings when the Vikings signed him, in that we just need to get over the edge with our quarterback. We have a roster built around him, and I think those are really compelling reasons, but I don't think we can underestimate just the fact that some teams have been bad for a really long time. And the one thing Kirk has displayed is you're not going to be bad. You're not going to be horrible with Kirk. Like, there is some sort of floor. So I think the Giants one is interesting because they've just had so much turmoil, so much, just a lack of consistency. And Kirk's consistent in, I mean, maybe not his game to game performance, but season to season, he's going to put up very similar stats and he's going to do a lot of the same things. So while that doesn't elevate you to a contender for some teams, getting kind of your first step back towards relevancy is a big thing. So I think the Giants are an interesting one. And then not really following that mold, but just another fun one and has to do with Kwesi is, what if the Browns wanted him? Obviously, Kwesi's going to have a lot of knowledge of people inside that organization. There's a lot of ties already with Stefanski. He obviously was the coordinator for Kirk. Who knows if he would want that situation back, but he's probably better than Baker Mayfield, or at least what Baker showed towards the end of last year. And maybe that's just the injury, maybe it's not, but maybe you could convince yourself there. And then you have kind of that synergy between the Vikings and the Browns that's now been going for a couple of years. So I think that would be fun storylines. Again, I don't think maybe the most it's going to happen, the most likely, but another fun one just for all the narratives that would go along with it. And they should be in the market for a quarterback if they're not going to consider Mayfield. And so, yeah, that was my other big option.
Well, how about Kirk to Green Bay for Jordan Love? There's your most fun one and most ridiculous. But also, if Aaron Rodgers retires, or goes, to Denver or something, that would be another one. Denver has the connections with the Vikings as well. I think that the whole point of the matter is that, he's probably not going to go in the division, or he's probably not going to go back to Washington. But there are a lot of teams that could have interest if Kwesi Adofo Mensah decides that's the route that he wants to go.
Yeah. Let's transition. We're going to tie in the playoff teams a little bit with this next one. Now Vikings conceivably have their general manager, and he's going to have to mold the team. And maybe he's looking to these playoff teams as which ones can I kind of adopt some of their principles, some of what they looked at. So if we're focusing on the 4 teams still left in the playoffs, is there one clear team to you that makes the most sense for the Vikings to model either how they're drafting, how they're going out and getting players, how they're evaluating a head coach, like any tie-in, any modeling you think the Vikings could do based on the teams that are still alive?
Yeah, I think that Cincinnati is probably the one, because I know they drafted number 1 overall. And so, that's a little bit different. The Vikings are drafting 12th, but you look at how quick they turn things around with a young quarterback. They hit on the quarterback. Joe Burrow is excellent. And then they went out and spent a bunch of money. They were one of the top spending teams on cornerbacks. They signed a bunch of corners. They signed an edge rusher in Trey Hendrickson. They signed some interior defensive linemen, and they paid good players, not players who are at the bottom of the barrel that they had a couple of million left over in the salary cap like the Vikings did to try and rebuild their secondary. Now, they went out and actually spent money, and they were able to do that around a rookie quarterback contract. Now, with Patrick Mahomes, you have to go back to the Alex Smith thing. Alex Smith was about to be a very expensive mid-pack quarterback, and they said, we've got to do better than that. And then when you look at the other 2 teams, the Rams had a limited quarterback that they decided to upgrade from with a trade, which I don't know if there's an opportunity there for the Vikings to do something like that, but that's an interesting route to make that deal and then go all in and get Odell Beckham and trade for Von Miller and sign everybody they can to stack a super team. But I think that San Francisco, especially with the Adofo Mensah connection, they've drafted extremely well. They've made very good decisions, and they have a really great coach. I mean, it doesn't get a whole lot better as offensive minds than Kyle Shanahan. And I think that's interesting too, is that these coaches are all offensive minded coaches who have had mostly consistency with their quarterback, except for Stafford coming in, but the rest of the roster having consistency with that McVay system. I think there's kind of a little bit of everything. There's also a point. We make everything about the quarterback, as it should be, but defensive lines are pretty important in this thing too. And there are some really, really good defensive linemen. The way that San Francisco has built their D-line is to win in the playoffs. And that's something that the Vikings have to rebuild a lot of parts of their defensive line, especially if they end up moving on from Danielle Hunter.
Yeah, my mind went to San Francisco, both for his tie-ins and, their parallels to the Vikings. And I think one point you didn't mention is, part of it is they're still in the playoffs, but even before they had a run, both their coordinators were guys that were highly sought after guys that you might want to sign in Mike McDaniel and D'Amico Ryans. And so it's player evaluation, it's evaluating coaches. Obviously, Kyle Shanahan's a really good coach. So, trying to get highly, very, very smart people on the staff, very analytically driven guys, which would fit Adofo Mensah's background. I think that makes a lot of sense and could be very feasible for them. And then going and drafting a guy and maybe letting him wait under Kirk. If you don't find that trade partner and you don't want to take money back for in the future, or you don't want to extend him and you're just going to ride it out and you're going to keep that talented roster alongside Kirk, see what happens. And then it seems like unless Jimmy wins the Super Bowl, they're still planning to kind of cut loose. And so that would be the mindset I would take too. Even if Kirk has a good year next year, if you commit to getting a quarterback, don't just be, enthralled by 1 year of production if Kirk ends up doing really, really well this year. So San Francisco is the one I jumped to as just practically a lot of the same things happening for both those teams in similar situations. And then obviously Mensah comes from that team. So I think that one makes a lot of sense. But I really like the Bengals one in the terms of just going out and spending money on key positions that you need. Probably should have spent a little bit more on that offensive line, which will most likely be a priority here. One of the things the Browns did immediately upon Stefanski getting there Andrew Berry getting there, Mensah getting there, was they immediately fortified that offensive line, and they became one of the best units right away. So you'd think he has seen the value of that, at least as something to move forward with.
Yeah, I agree. And I mean, there is no one absolute dead set model. Here's how you do it. And it's the one and only way. If Cleveland got better quarterback play from Baker Mayfield this year, we might be talking about Cleveland instead of Cincinnati there. But Mayfield played hurt. It didn't go very well for him. He had a lot of interceptions. And so even though they had that great offensive line, their quarterback's throwing it to the other team. But, one thing that is, there's two things that are similar. One that you mentioned about all the teams is that they all have looked for upgrades at quarterback at one point or another. Like Cincinnati had Andy Dalton and eventually decided they just had to move on. And even though San Francisco still has Garoppolo, they did the same thing, figuring Garoppolo will be expensive in the future and that he's more of a mid-pack quarterback. So they got somebody who has a stronger arm, can run with the ball. We've seen quite a few teams do that. Even Buffalo, who was 13 seconds away from being here, their quarterback, Tyrod Taylor, in middle of the pack, and then they move on and get Josh Allen, and it transforms their franchise. I mean, that's one thing. Another thing is playmakers are everywhere in these playoffs. I mean, it is incredible what the Rams have done with Cooper Kupp, and Odell Beckham has fit in there way better than I think a lot of us thought he was going to. San Francisco uses Deebo Samuel all over the field. Creative ways to get playmakers the ball. Tyreek Hill has been a huge part of Patrick Mahomes' success, probably doesn't get enough credit for that, how great they are at keeping Tyreek Hill involved in that offense, even though everybody knows he's going to be a huge part of it. So every one of these teams, Jamar Chase has immediately exploded on the scene. The Vikings already have that with Justin Jefferson. Now it's getting more of that, and it's using it the right way, which maybe there was some left on the table in recent years.
For sure. All right, last question before I get you out of here. We got to do something related to the playoffs. Conference Championship Week coming up this Sunday. I want to know from you, which single player or coach has the most on the line this weekend?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that Cincinnati is kind of the up-and-coming team, and so they're the ones that if they lose this game, they'll be happy to be there. And it won't feel like, oh, well, we missed our one and only chance ever with Joe Burrow. That'll kind of remind me of Kansas City losing to New England a couple of years ago in Mahomes' first year as a starter, where it's like, well, you kind of have a feeling that they're going to be here year after year. Kansas City is always playing with house money because they had their Super Bowl. And after you've gotten it, it's not that they don't want it again. It's just that you've gotten it. And they hadn't had a Super Bowl win since way, way back in the day. And you're sort of golden after that. I think it's probably Sean McVay and the Los Angeles Rams because they went so all in on this Super Bowl. We have to win this Super Bowl with Matt Stafford. And boy, they came close to letting it slip through their fingers, on Sunday. But if they are able to win this Super Bowl, it'll be one of the only times I can remember that a team went all in and did all these crazy moves and sacrificed their future entirely to try to win right now. It'll justify it all. Maybe you could argue getting to the NFC Championship justifies it, but with the way they handled their draft capital, their cap space, all that stuff, I mean, this was it. It was Super Bowl or bust for them. One of the rare all-in situations. I think that this is a huge achievement for San Francisco one way or the other. Just being here and making another Super Bowl would really solidify Kyle Shanahan as one of the elite, great coaches in the NFL. But I think if San Francisco loses, you'll still say, well, it was great for them to be there. With the Rams, it's a failure if they don't reach the Super Bowl.
Yeah, and I think you can't justify it as a success with Matt Stafford if you don't make it to the Super Bowl, at least because you made it to the Super Bowl with Goff. And the whole thing was, we need a better quarterback to get us to win the Super Bowl. And so you get rid of Goff, and then you don't make it there again with your better quarterback, with a roster even more slanted towards winning immediately. That one feels like they need to at least make it to the Super Bowl to feel like you had some success there. The guy I'd go to is one we already mentioned, Jimmy. I mean, if he wins, he makes it that much harder for them to get rid of him. Like, there is not a lot of precedent for you taking your team to the playoffs, no matter what you looked like, and then them deciding, yeah, I know we made it to the Super Bowl with you, but we're going to go for this unproven rookie. Like, that becomes so much more difficult to do. And so if he does that, and if even they somehow win, like, it becomes so much more difficult. And even if they decide to move off him, Jimmy then can use that to get any job he really wants. I mean, it's hard to turn down that guy when you see him go to the Super Bowl, you see him win, and it then becomes easy to say, we can figure that out too. We can figure out a situation to get him there. It's like the supreme version of the Kirk Cousins thing. If he wins a Super Bowl and then they still get rid of him, it's okay. If he was able to do that, I know Kyle Shanahan's great. I know Debo's great. I know that defense is great, but we got to be able to do something like that. So I think for Jimmy and his future in the league, it's going to be a big game, because if they make it there, it just becomes that much more difficult to get rid of him. And San Francisco is probably the best place for him to be. So that's where he'd want to be. And so it's a big game for him.
Right. And if they don't win and he doesn't play well, you'll say, well, their playoff run was a fluke. It was based on a blocked punt and botched play at the end of the Dallas game. So it's amazing how single games carry so much weight for people's careers and their reputations and things like that. But that, folks, is the NFL.
All right, Matt. Well, thank you so much for joining us. We're going to have so much more coverage on YouTube, on the podcast, on purpleinsider.substack, on Bring Me the News in the next week, as both the GM gets finalized and I imagine the coaching stuff gets finalized here rather quickly, so they can get rolling into the offseason, get rolling into the draft. We will have coverage of it all. Matt, thank you for joining me today on Hot Routes.
Thanks, Paul.